Everybody, welcome back to Startup Happy Hour. I'm your host, Diana Chen, and I'm here today with our guest, Niket Desai. He is in design and product strategy at Time by Ping. You'll remember last week we had Patrick Gardner on, the CTO at Time by Ping, so we're bringing on more of the Time by Ping team, but really want to talk to Niket about some of his past experiences as well before he joined Time by Ping and his interesting transition from being an investor in Time by Ping to now working at Time by Ping. So I'm going to bring him on and let him tell you all about that. Hey, Niket, welcome. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks so much. Happy St. Patrick's Day, Diana.
Oh, yeah. I didn't even realize that. COVID times, you're just at home all the time, and what are holidays anyway? But happy St. Patrick's Day. All right. So we had Patrick on last week, and so our listeners got to hear a little bit about what Time by Ping is already. Why don't you just give us the quick 30-second reminder of what Time by Ping does, and then tell us about your experience as you were actually the first investor in the company, and then you ended up joining the company, and now you work there. So just tell us about that whole process.
Yeah, Time by Ping's mission is to return time to people. We presently do that by automating timesheet creation for lawyers. So we build software that sits on your computer, looks at all of the digital work you do, and we create a timesheet that you're able to send to your clients to bill that's compliant and much faster than how lawyers do it today. I was able to join the company because one of my best friends from university actually started the company, Ryan Alshak, and he had been discussing this idea many years ago as a lawyer. He came from practicing. And while I was living in India working at Flipkart, I'd flown up to Israel to see him. He was working on a case out there. And kind of over a long discussion at about 4 a.m. on a beach, he was kind of just told me, hey, I'm going to quit being a lawyer. And this was quite a stark thing because he was a star lawyer making a really awesome wage, flying first class to Israel. And anybody else that was 26, 27 looking at that would say, you've made it. This was kind of the whole point of all the work you've done. And here he was basically about to throw it away. And he said he wanted to start a company that was going to do approximately what we do now. And my advice to him at the time on that beach was, yeah, don't start a company.
So tell me more about that. Yeah, why is that?
And that's because really most people shouldn't start companies. They're hard to fathom the ups and downs that you go through, and from the outside it looks so wonderful. And what I found is that by telling everyone don't do that, the ones who are going to do it will just do it anyways, and they're probably more suited for the endeavor. And I think he's going to be a star CEO as well. He already is, but I think truly a force of nature if we can get this thing to where we believe it can go.
That's awesome. So take me back to when you first heard about Time by Ping and decided to invest in it. You were the first investor in Time by Ping. Now they have a lot more investors. Tell me, what was it about Time by Ping that really drew you in and inspired you to be the first investor in the company?
I think it definitely was the person. The challenge with, so kind of how I was first told about thinking about investing in startups is you're really paying attention to people, ideas, and markets. And there's a lot of good discussion on which one matters the most. For me, the fact that Ryan was going to exit that life because of a single problem, which was he hated timekeeping, was really profound because essentially this person was going to throw away 7 years of schooling, 2 to 3 years of working in industry and working at a very high level. And the more that he told me about it, the more it became apparent to me that it didn't matter whether he was right or wrong, but that he was going to do it. And if you find someone that has that level of conviction that you trust in their skill set, I told him, look, I want to support you. I'm living in India at the moment. And he was like, hey, let's go start a company. Obviously, my background's in building software and companies. And I was like, I can't do it right now. But what we discussed was I would give him some money and then we'd figure out the rest later. And then as I came back from India, went through becoming an investor with the University of California, the timing was right for finally me to come back and join. And so in a way, this is just the continuation and of a conversation that we had many years ago on a beach in Israel.
Got it. Got it. So when you first invested in the company, you kind of already had in the back of your mind that you would probably do some work for the company at some point as well, right? Whenever time freed up for you.
Yeah, I think that when you have an opportunity to work with friends and your friends are really talented, you just you're just at this point most of your life is figuring out how to create windows to do that with them. So I really think of people's time as trajectories. You kind of have these phases and arcs of your life, and what you're hoping is that you can work with people that you want to see every day because we spend 8 to 10 hours of our lives every day at work and with the people we work with, and also being in a situation in your life where you can afford to take either those risks or even have the ability to be afforded those opportunities. And so I knew that what I was looking for was that timing, and that what I needed to do was start the arc. And 4 years later, it finally timed up.
Yeah, so that's actually an interesting thought because I think a lot of people out there would caution people against starting companies with or working in general with their friends and family because you never know, just because you're best friends with them in a social setting doesn't mean that you're going to work great with them. And even like back in college, everybody said like maybe don't be roommates with your best friend because that can cause a fallout. You can ruin the friendship. Was that something that you were ever concerned about with Ryan? Like, what if this doesn't work out and kind of destroys our friendship? Or were you just like, no, I have total faith in this guy. Like, I know we can work well together.
Yeah, that's such an important point. It's what I didn't know. Actually, we didn't have a working relationship prior to that. So what was really interesting and ultimately quite fruitful was, I basically served as an investor and advisor. And obviously, having built startups and coming from the investment side, I was able to work with him on fundraises, on product strategy, on company and organization development. So we got to work with each other for many years in a low stakes kind of way that showed us that not only did we conflict extraordinarily well together, meaning that we could disagree in a way that was complementary and constructive, but that we also had deeply aligned values. And what that told me, that took away almost all of the risk that I felt when I was joining the company because we wanted the same things and we worked in a way where our ideas got better as we worked on them together. And that I just have found to be extraordinarily rare. And it's something that I look for in anyone I'm working with. So if I meet entrepreneurs that I might invest with or entrepreneurs I'm trying to help, what I'm also looking for is, do they have constructive patterns of conflict? Because people can be complementary in skill sets and domain knowledge, but in terms of values and approach to solving problems, those need to be both complementary and constructive. They can't just be one or the other with it expecting to work for a long time.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. It's almost like the test of whether you'll have a good working relationship with somebody is can you argue constructively,
And
basically.
that comes from, what shared values does there is it gives you the benefit of saying, this person wants what I want, so therefore do not become defensive, try to listen more. And then the complementary part of that equation is about this person brings unique expertise and perspective that improves the quality of this idea and drives it forward. And so when you have both of those things together, you actually have a compounding effect. And we see that a lot in the projects that we work on. Obviously, he kind of looks after a lot of the company management and fundraising and sales side, GTM side, and I'm almost entirely focused on also the company side, but more on the product and kind of like our just general approach to technology side. And so in many ways, when we meet, you have the entirety of the company mapped together, and that's a really good place to be when you're trying to work on this constructive complementary equation.
Yeah, for sure. And so that's something I wanted to ask you too about is your currently your title is design and product strategy. That's not a traditional title that you would see out there. And you actually have a history of non-traditional titles. And I want to get into that with you creating your own title at one of your previous jobs, Flipkart. We'll get into that in a minute, but tell us more. What does design and product strategy mean? What does your day-to-day look like? Like, what do you actually do?
Yeah. So I think that I would be traditionally labeled as VP of product. the reason why I call it design and product strategy is because ultimately that's our job. Is first of all, Michael, who's our head of design at the company, is an incredibly talented creative, and he really showed me that design can have a key role in a company's strategy and success, and that historically it's just a function. And so I wanted to honor that by, first of all, elevating that to the highest order. And so most people kind of, when I worked at Google, you kind of have 1A, 1B. And 1As were engineers. They were kind of seen as the best. And then 1Bs were product managers. And they were essentially engineers that just didn't code day to day at the time in that era of Google. And that was really amazing at the time. But what's amazing about the world today is, depending on what kind of product you're building and what kind of technology you're building, because it's become far easier to stitch together really advanced technologies that historically were kind of competitive advantages, is that actually if you're a great social network builder, if you're a great community builder, if you're a fantastic product designer, these things can be as important as your technical prowess. And so what I'm trying to do is evolve what was historically product management into kind of directionally where I think all of this is going. And part of that is not writing it that way, and that opens up more opportunities for people to consider us very differently. On a day-to-day basis, my job is I try to talk to customers every day. So we take an NPS rolling scores where we talk to a lot of people about our customers and surveys come back. So I try to email every single person that sends us a response, if only to thank them. I think about a lot of the things that are happening about 1 month out plus. On the day-to-day levels, I really trust Patrick. I think having a very strong technical counterpart is so awesome, because what it allows you to do is not be mired by the day-to-day fires when you have someone that understands product, strategy, and vision, but is also managing the company on a day-to-day basis. Because what we want to bring is precision and accuracy to the things we're going to do, which then improves what's happening currently, which then makes everything run more smoothly.
For sure. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and I love that instead of just taking on a traditional title, you actually really did a deep dive and thought really hard about what it is that you would be doing and came up with something that fit that mold a little bit better. So the other thing that you're working on at the moment is you're involved with the Palo Alto Design Company as a partner and thinker. So tell us a little bit more about what that is, and what is, again, going along the theme of non-traditional titles. Partner, we all sort of, have heard of that, but partner and thinker. So tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so Padco is something that Xander, my old co-founder from Punch, started, and he was very early at Google when they were ultimately inventing what's now known as sprint designs, or design sprints. And the idea of Padco, which is also, I'll kind of reveal it here, it's Pollock and Desai company. And it's funny, we just had this discussion. Palo Alto represented this ethos that we both thought about, that when people say we want to bring Silicon Valley to another geography, what they're really saying is the spirit of entrepreneurship and the spirit of trying to build something that pays attention to customers, that tries really hard to innovate every day rather on longer cycles. And so Padco is a housing for all of the fun projects that Xander and I come up with. So we do a lot of design sprints for companies. We do consultation projects. It truly is our playground. And in its extension of, in many ways, this company that we had started together called Punched, which we had sold to Google, it's kind of all of the ideas we never got to do that we were hoping to do within that construct of a company, that we just decided, why can't we do those things anyways? And it's a sandbox in many ways.
That's really cool. I like that a lot. So I want to do a deeper dive into your background because you've been involved in so many different things. And one of the things so going back to before you joined Time by Ping, the last thing that you worked on was you were an investment fellow at UCLA, or actually just University of California systems, right? Not specifically UCLA, right? So tell me a little bit more about that. What does an investment fellow do? What kind of brought you into that? Because you moved into that from a startup and then previously from Google. So you were sort of already in the startup world, and then you went to work for a school system, which is a transition that, we don't see all the time. So talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so first of all, I was very fortunate. The wonderful people at the University of California in the investment office, Jagdeep, who's the CIO, Arthur, and a number of other folks, they were keen on bringing in an investment fellow that was connected to the entrepreneurial world. And in particular, they were looking at exploring how all of the entrepreneurship that comes out of the UC system could be better supported because of the tremendous value that the University of California, in terms of its IP, people, and research, has presented to the world. So some of the work that I did there in terms of research of all of the public cap companies and acquired companies started by either University of California alumni or IP or research, it's about $1.5 trillion of public equity value. And that's not even including Apple. And so the premise of that role was to connect the massive endowment and pension and working capital that the University of California has, which is about like $120 billion, and connect that to the tremendous entrepreneurial research and innovation cycle that is found at the University of California. And that was basically what the role was set out to do. I got connected through the House Fund. So Jeremy Fiance, who's a Berkeley alumni that started a Berkeley-focused investment fund called the House Fund, which I'm also a partner at, he set me up with Jagdeep many years ago, and I thought it was a very interesting opportunity to go and do good work for where I went to school at Berkeley and the UC system, almost to, in a way, pay this debt that I felt that I owed, this obligation, because that university set me up with so many of my friends that I'm working with now and put me on the path for technology and really supported me in a way that, I feel so lucky to have been supported by. So that was the impetus as to why I went back to become an investment fellow.
Got it. And so I know you've done a lot of research on this topic, and something that has come up in past episodes a lot with especially startup founders is, what is the value of a college education when you want to go and found a company? This has been, past guests have had all sorts of different views on this, whether college education is necessary or valuable or not. And we've even had guests on in the past who've dropped out of college to start a company, and they're very successful doing that now. So having, gone through college, started your own company, and then gone back to the UC system to work on this specific issue, what are your thoughts on the value of a college education for entrepreneurs?
In the end, entrepreneurship is an extraordinarily unique journey. I think that there's been, in 2010 when I was starting my first company, there was essentially no channels for entrepreneurship. And now all of a sudden you have podcasts, you have Y Combinator, you have 500 startups, you have so many resources out there that made it easier. College is going through, or university systems in general are going through an interesting phase because of two big trends that are finally taking real hold. One is that education is becoming cheaper, quality education. And so you can go to YouTube and Khan Academy, Coursera, people like Goggin out there are building new versions of how do we educate people on their own terms, in their own place, in a way that's cheaper and more affordable and accessible. So that's one. And the other side of university kind of value is around community building. And that's also changed. I think that Reddit has completely upended the idea of how communities are built from the perspective of it used to be location, right? So even here in Silicon Valley, you'd have a concentration of people that are interested in technology. Now you can have subsets of what people are interested in these small subreddits, and you can be bound on the internet and Twitter as another place where people coalesce. Facebook groups probably as well. I don't have Facebook anymore, but I'm sure that's a big one as well. And so The university value proposition in terms of access to high quality education and high quality communities is being challenged. And I think that universities are going to have to change as well. Now, that's not true for everything. So if you want to do high-end research and like labs and things that require laboratories and access to very specific technical capabilities, that's still somewhat, protected. But the vast majority of a university education is currently being challenged by far cheaper, less kind of geographically required alternatives. And I think that's a good thing. And as people think about becoming entrepreneurs, there's an element in which going to a great university, like a top 20 university, can help you in terms of network building and brand building. But the rest is just an expense. And they're going to have to price that out and figure out if that advances what they're trying to do or not.
For sure. Yeah. I think with, YouTube and online coding boot camps and all the MOOCs that are out there, universities really have to do something differently to compete. And I guess I know you've done a lot of thinking around this, but from your point of view, what are some things universities can do to add value and to actually differentiate themselves from the online boot camps and the MOOCs and all the free resources out there?
So one is just the business model. My fundamental takeaway from my fellowship, and something that Jagdeep was advocating for as well, is we have to invest in the university innovation. And what that means is, so earlier I was saying that we had about $1.5 trillion of public equities that the University of California has directly or indirectly created. We didn't see any of that. Our combined endowments are at about $15 billion. Just, and if we had just captured 1% of that public equity that we had indirectly had exposure to and held, it's larger than our entire endowment today. The university business model is primarily predicated on fees, right? Which is going away because you have, and so when you're competing with a $20,000 a year education, but I can have 60 to 70% of that for the price of whatever it costs to buy an ISP in your area, plus subscribing to these, different channels or boot camps, that's a very difficult thing. And so one of the things that we were looking at was, can you diversify the business model of universities to be more connected to your innovation programs, to downstream alumni programs? And that's something that I think institutions like Stanford and Yale and a couple of the other ones have done extraordinarily well. And where I think the University of California, in both culture and structure, is just something that we're on the early parts of that journey towards.
Got it. And so what would that look like in practice, I guess, when you say universities need to invest more in their talent? And, I'm thinking, are you talking about if somebody that goes to UC Berkeley and graduates from there and starts their own company, maybe, University of California can invest in their company or something is that what you're talking about?
That's exactly right. So a lot of IP systems at universities actually hold tremendous amounts of IP. The problem is processing all of it. So there's a question of when should it be licensed? How much? When should you even do the work for that? On the other end of the spectrum, there's who is starting companies, right? Building infrastructure to understand within your community who's doing what, and then how can you essentially bring them capital, expertise, IP research. And those systems were in the early days. So from our perspective at the University of California, when I was there, we were in the early days, right? So we were primarily using venture capital and funds and kind of some alternative investment arrangements to explore what the possibilities were. So small experiments that are important that are starting to bear fruit is the University of California is a key investor in the House Fund. A company like Bow Capital, which is a fund that was started in partnership with the University of California with Vivek Ranadive, was built from scratch to explore methods of how we could support innovation. There's a lot of individual incubators and smaller things happening across campuses, but the question is going to be, what are the repeatable resources that can be done at high volume what are those systems going to be built, and how do we inject, for instance, just even alumni back into these systems? So just to put in perspective, one of the other explorations was there's about 1.7 million, 1.8 million living alumni from the University of California. How can you direct that exceptional talent into UC-enabled innovation systems, whether that's laboratories, research, startups, essentially any type of like modern business? And that's where I think the future of leveraging brand and community and to an extent high quality access of information is going to go for these education systems. Because otherwise they're going to end up in a world where I think the next generation of builders are going to look at those institutions and say, that simply is not a good return on an investment.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's such an interesting perspective, and I agree with it 100%. And I really hope that universities do make that pivot in the future and that we see more and more university systems developing these venture funds and other programs to support entrepreneurs. So last thing about this is let's flip to the student side of it then. So for people listening that are maybe currently in college, what are some things that you would recommend to them if they're interested in entrepreneurship and they're, thinking about like, do I finish up university? Like, what are some things they can do while they're in university finishing up, or if they're thinking about dropping out and starting a company? Like, what do you have to say to people like that?
I think what I would say to them is your experience at university has competing incentives. The university wants to process you through it to get a degree in a period of time, right? So if you're an engineering major like I was, you have 4 years to get your degree and then you're processed out. And so that then opens up a spot because there's a certain target ratio of students to teacher and administration to teachers that they're trying to maintain, that essentially is this entire system. So the first thing you have to kind of figure out is, hey, is my university incentivized to process me as a student or to enable and support me as a budding entrepreneur? That's the first question you have to ask yourself, because there are scenarios in which that is true. I think Stanford, I think Berkeley, I think a couple of other schools do a good job of providing those avenues. The second thing you have to figure out is what you're studying, is it actually helping something that you want to do? So when I was in school, I wasn't particularly interested in studying engineering for engineering's sake. I just wanted to adopt the models and the frameworks that I thought were very interesting by examining the world in real terms, in like physics terms, or in biology terms, or in computer science terms, because I felt that the world was more easily expressed through those systems than if I went and studied business or an alternative thing. And so the second thing I would consider is the classes that I'm taking, which is usually a subset of a major that I'm part of, but you don't always have to make those two things related. Are they actually advancing the things that I want to learn about and giving me the room to explore those ideas? And for me, I took a lot of business and entrepreneurship classes in my summers. So I kind of took like core, what I call analytical thinking during my, semesters, and then during my summers I would take kind of what I call purely exploratory things like geology and just anything that I thought was interesting. And so what I would say is, if that's not the case, the two things you can correct there are you can use summers if you have it available to you, or you can just start taking classes that are completely outside of the realm of what you'd expect to be taking. And so one of the things I really hope to do long term is set up a endowment for folks who are in engineering or STEAM that also cross over to arts, because I think the intersection of arts and engineering and arts and mathematics is more interesting than any of those individually. And then the third thing is just, what are you in university for? So most people, by the time they even examine why they've come to university, it's usually after they've left it. And I don't think that dropping out is a good idea for most people, because I do believe that brand value has certain assistance in their socioeconomic mobility. Being able to say, I graduated from a school does matter. I think it's mattering less, but you have to figure out whether you have the network and the opportunities to afford not having that piece of paper. And so, for those, it's a very common trope that entrepreneurs drop out, but usually it's because of one of the three things we just discussed, which is they knew what they wanted to do and the ROI, either in time or money, wasn't equal, and they had the opportunities and, and frankly, situation to take on that risk. And so I think it's a little disingenuous to tell people, if you know what you want to do and you want to be an entrepreneur, just drop out, because there are downsides, and you have to really think about that in your unique context.
Yeah, for sure. It's really interesting hearing you talk about this because we just had somebody on recently, David Kabrowski, who has dropped out of University of Michigan twice already to take on really interesting opportunities. And I think, he's working on a company right now, but thinking about going back and finishing it, and hearing him talk about his analysis and like how he came to the decision to drop out and then to go back to school and then to drop out again. That was really interesting. And then hearing you talk about it, I mean, I think the overarching idea behind this is that while it does work out for some people, it's really a case by case scenario, and you really have to analyze, like in your specific instance, whether it will be more valuable for you to drop out or to stay in school. And I would say probably 99% of the time, or at least like over 90% of the time, it will be more advantageous for you to stay in school, is what it sounds like to me.
I don't know what that is. What I would say broadly is you need to challenge university as a construct for yourself. So if you're in school today or thinking about going to school, and you are only thinking about what school you want to go to or what the prestige is, or what I would really ask you is, what are you actually interested in learning about? Does that place allow you to do that in a flexible way? Does it allow you to do it in a way where what you get is worth the serious amount of investment into it? We break down colleges into their costs. Like, why would I pay 200 grand for a piece of paper? Is kind of a common trope I hear. I don't care about 200 grand. I'm starting a company that is in the business of time. My question is, why should I spend 4 years on something of critical part of my life if I can't even justify, again, not what it needs to do in the future, like specifically, but justify it to myself that it's worth the investment.
Yeah,
And,
100%.
and I think you can do that on a quarter by basis. I think you can do it on a semester by semester basis. So many people go to school and don't take any interesting classes. They just stick to their major and they never explore the boundaries. And I think that's if there's anything that I would say that makes me sad about the current state of universities, it's just students who basically go study one major, never leave the bounds of that major, when you have such incredible colleagues, other students, professors who have spent decades thinking about ideas right at your disposal, and to so flippantly not engage. Some of my most important classes at Berkeley were in philosophy. I still think geology was my favorite class. I learned about how to store nuclear waste in mountains and repositories like that. And I think about that to this day. And it makes me excited. And I really, really love that class.
That's
And
awesome.
I don't use geology at all. But it keeps me excited and interested and curious.
For sure. Yeah. And I'm a huge proponent of the philosophy classes as well. I think that it just teaches you to think. It doesn't matter what major you are or what you want to do. I think those are just solid classes to take. All right. So I want to keep diving back into more of your background. I'm going to sort of lump all of this together for the sake of time. So going all the way back, you graduated college, and then pretty much right after, or shortly thereafter, you started your own company, Punched. And then that sold to Google. You went to work for Google for about four to 5 years. And then you went on to work at a startup, Flipkart, in India. Okay, so a lot going on there. Unpack that for me. Let's just start with, what was it like to start your own company right out of school? What made you decide to do that?
Yeah, so the common trope across these 3 years is actually phones, smartphones specifically. So when I was in university, the iPhone come out. It's kind of a crazy thought, but 15 years ago, iPhones didn't exist. But the iPhone had come out, and it was very interesting to see everyone talk about this iPhone, calling it a phone. And when I finally got my hands on one, I had bought one from Craigslist and opened it up actually, and unfortunately also bricked it and didn't eat that month. But it was a computer, And so as someone that kind of grew up in a household where my father studied electrical engineering and computers were not something that was foreign, it was interesting to see a computer in a very beautiful case that people were referring to as a phone, because I was like, well, that's weird. Why is everyone calling this a phone when this thing's actually just a computer that happens to make phone calls? And that kind of set the course for this general question of what happens if everyone has a computer on them all the time, and those things can do things like tell you where you are and connect to the internet. And so that led to Punched, where I met Xander and Reed, where the goal of Punched was to take those buy 10 get one free cards that you get at coffee shops and other stores and put them on your phone. So the idea was to kind of solve that pain point and also connect small businesses to this burgeoning digital commerce world that was happening. And I think you're seeing now Square and the power of these companies really start to show, because we all came from that same era. When I got to Google, they were very interested in connecting that kind of localized commerce to their mapping endeavors and Google Maps, and that's kind of what the underlying hypothesis of why we were acquired was trying to solve. And it was kind of this amazing thing, because you go from a very small company, which is what we were, to kind of one of the greatest startups and then companies of our generation, and seeing how just the quality of talent there, the way they thought about the world, how big they are, it really opened my eyes on what the end state of greatness in company building could look like. And it's not to say that they've done it best, but at that time it was beyond what I could have imagined. So in a very short period of time leaving college, which is obviously, for most people another set of formative years, right? Is you kind of have your formative years before college, through college, and then immediately after college. I was exiting Berkeley. I was entering a world of entrepreneurship before entrepreneurship was cool. We were just getting out of the kind of great financial crisis of the 08, 09 kind of area of credits and housing market. And then I got to Google and kind of saw it before it became a real behemoth. And that was really just an amazing time, because it showed you that the future was going to be digital, the future was going to be connected, and that there was just so much to build. And so I have this boundless optimism on all the things people have to build to kind of rewrite society. And I'm even more emboldened after this COVID period of how much we've seen our society falter and much of the veneer taken away, that I would just tell everybody, like, man, there are so many problems. There's never been a better time to go and build stuff. And so that's kind of what my early life was. How I got to Flipkart was also through phones. When Google acquired Motorola, I'd come off of a medical sabbatical, and I joined Motorola with Puneet Soni, who was my boss there, and we were trying to build really good phones. We obviously were inspired by the iPhone, and we felt that Google software with a great hardware platform could really change the game of how people interacted with smartphones. And we had some modicum of success there with Motorola, but we ended up selling that off to Lenovo. What happened was, in the business of selling phones, one of our biggest sellers and suppliers for selling these phones was a small e-commerce company in India, which would later be called Flipkart. And we became very close with them, and Puneet and I had the opportunity to go and essentially go out there and join them. And Flipkart, when we talk about innovative companies, they represent all of the things you'd hope for when it comes to startups. They were gritty. They paid attention to their customers and their users. They changed and opened up a lot of the e-commerce possibility in India. They made large-scale funding, especially from non-Indian funders, available and commonplace in India. So much of what Flipkart was able to accomplish as a company was actually a kind of a movement in a way. And even though they sold to Walmart for a tremendous sum, and to that degree have a lot of work to do left, I think their greatest accomplishment, Sachin, Binny, everyone that was there, is going to be making large-scale innovation that's kind of globally enabled, commonplace in India. And I think that's just an amazing thing.
Yeah, that's awesome. And just because I teased this earlier, talk about, you were chief of staff at Flipkart. And I know I think you have a Medium article out, or you wrote about this somewhere, but you have a whole thing with, if you don't see a position at a company that suits your skill set, just make your own. And so talk a little bit more about that. Like, how can people go and really do exactly what they're passionate about doing, what they're good at doing, what they were put here to do? How do they go about navigating this?
Yes, when I became a chief of staff, Praneeth had asked me to come on board in that capacity because I think that the end state was that I would head back into product. But because we had an unclear path of how we were going to evolve the organization. So a product is just a kind of a meta, but a product is an outcome of an organization, which is an outcome of people. So in this kind of like function setup, people go into a function that then outputs an organization, and the construction of that organization outputs a product. So the idea was that when we got there, it wasn't about, oh, here's how we make a mark on how our product is going to look and feel, which I think a lot of more product-oriented people might think that's where they're supposed to make their mark, but rather how we wanted to evolve the organization itself to meet the challenges unknown ahead of us. And so the chief of staff role allowed for the flexibility in title because so much of an organization is reliant on titles and understanding what people do so you can operate more efficiently. Chief of staff gave me the flexibility to be many things to many people. And more importantly, it also allowed me to apply product thinking and systems approaches to historically areas where you wouldn't necessarily have people that kind of came from more of an engineering systems design background to it. So like we applied it to things just like hiring process, because at one point we were at our peak, we're hiring 250 people a week. We were solving problems that broke conventional infrastructure. And so the idea is that if you know what you care a lot about, but it doesn't fit into an existing role, your options are you either have to somehow translate your skills to be highly lined up with that, or else you're going to end up essentially becoming counterproductive to the organization. Or you need to actually modify the organization to absorb this kind of like nebulous type of role. And if you have a sponsor, like, Praneeth was a big advocate for me, and vice versa, I offered a lot of extra capacity to him, then you're going to be in a great situation. And if you don't see that, again, this goes back to just assessing your situation, your superior and your organization, and saying, is this going to absorb a nebulous role well? And if yes, great, then build it and go jump into it. Kind of like in university when you create your own majors. Great. If not, then you need to really think about whether you're going to be able to create success there. Especially, given that everything is divided by time, which is kind of a fundamental equalizer.
For sure. Yeah. I just love the way that you will take things that everybody takes for granted, like just traditional titles, going to college, all of this, and break it down and ask, like, is this real? Like, does this actually make sense? Like, why do we do this? Are we doing this just because we've always done this? Or is there actually a reason behind it that makes sense? And I just love that whole way of thinking. So
I was just going to say, on that front, I would just also caution people. I hope that the takeaway isn't challenge everything strongly. It's challenge everything loosely. So, like, it might be better to challenge something, realize that it's not correct, but it's not so wrong that you need to upend it. And that's kind of been an important learning curve for me, because now I'm just better at saying, okay, how do I actually think about this? Do I care a lot or a little? And do I think it has huge upside to this organization or endeavor or not? And usually what I try to do is pick the ones where the upside is really large and it's worth the considerable stress that you put into the system and on yourself when you challenge anything.
For sure. Yeah. All right. So this next segment, usually we do, it's called Explain Your Tweet, where I dive through the guest's Twitter account and pull out some cryptic or interesting tweets. But you actually have, it looks like, well, you have 2 tweets on your Twitter right now. It looks like you wiped everything and started anew, right? It doesn't look like a new account.
No, you're right. I have been trying to figure out what my relationship with who I was in the past is. And Twitter is so interesting because, if you look at like a Jack Dorsey, right? He has to live with every single tweet he's tweeted since he started the service. He just recently obviously sold, I think his first tweet or whatever it were, on NFTs, using an NFT. And what I wanted to do was, I actually had a book made with all my tweets, and I printed them. It's up here. And then I deleted my entire Twitter. And so the only historical construct that I at least have access to kind of what my thinking over the years is kind of a physical copy. And I'm trying to figure out, I'm a big fan of Twitter, huge fan. I just consume it. And I don't know that I have anything to say that I think is particularly interesting. And I think that Twitter is even harder to do it well because you have to do it in a way that's clear, concise, and interesting. And I think the people who are great at writing on Twitter, they just stupefy me because of how much talent they have. And I just have mad respect for people that put themselves out there and do it in an elegant and way.
I mean, okay, so a couple of things there. First of all, really cool idea that you just printed it out. And you printed out your tweets. Is that just like for you to have as a memory of what your old tweets were? Or is that something that you're actually like selling or distributing?
I use it to humble myself. So anytime I feel like I'm particularly smart, I like probably immediately after this, I will pull it out, read something from 2013 and remind myself I was an idiot then and I'm an idiot now.
And then second thing is I think you have tons of great insight and great things to say. So hopefully I'll see you tweeting a little bit more and sharing some of that because, I mean, I understand what you're saying. I think it's always easy to think like there's somebody smarter out there, somebody writing better tweets, more clever tweets than I am. But I think you have a lot to share. So I hope that you'll share some of that to the Twitterverse. So last thing here, tell people a little bit more about who Niket is outside of work and all of this thinking that you do. Like, what are some of your hobbies? What are some, maybe fun facts about you that you want to share with the audience?
Yeah, I think if there's one thing I really love, it's getting people together. I think so much of our lives is really on our relationships. And so I love working on restaurants. I've had the opportunity to partner and be in a few here in San Francisco. And the reason why I'm in them is certainly not to make money, but it is to enable people to see each other. Because, and I think this year has really taught us that. And I think that out of all the work we do in our lives and all the changes and people and efforts that we have in our lives, I think we'll care most when it's all said and done about how we made other people feel and how we brought people together. And so anything I can do to enable that and support that are things I'm interested in. And that's also why I love to cook. And you'll find me as a big reader. I think reading is an amazing opportunity to live tons of lives without having to live them yourselves. And I just find myself in awe and continuously humbled by reading books.
I love it. All right. So I always end every episode with 2 just fun random questions. And so the first one I have for you, since, we talked a lot about this, is if you could go back to college and redo one thing, knowing what you know now, what is one thing that you would do differently?
I used to skip a lot of my school to do what I wanted to do, like set up for parties, hang out with friends. I don't know that I would change much, honestly, looking back. I'd probably keep it exactly the same because I'm extraordinarily grateful for how everything turned out.
Wow, that's awesome. Love that answer. And then the second one, since you just said you love partnering with restaurants, you love cooking and all of that, if you could only eat one food for the rest of your life, what would that be? And it doesn't have to be like a super specific dish or anything. It can be like a food group or, like a genre if it's like an ethnic cuisine or something.
Yeah, I grew up eating, it's called DBS, Dal Bhat Rotli Shak, which is DBRS, which is kind of an Indian classic home-cooked meal for my mom. And, it reminds me of my family and my roots, and that's probably what I would eat every day, if I could. And it's good too.
I have not had that before, so now I'm curious. Is that something I can get in restaurants, or is that more of just like a home-cooked thing?
It's no, you can get it in restaurants. Dal is there's many different types, black dal, yellow dal, and then rotli is like kind of like a variant of naan, but it's more accustomed to northern India and especially in Gujarat, which is where our family's from. And shak is basically it means like any type of vegetable that you usually would have like as a side with it. And so you can have, and you've probably had many of them if you've been to any Indian restaurants. Those were all shaks. So yeah,
Got it. Awesome. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Niket, for being here. I really appreciate your time and I love the conversation that we had. It's super insightful. Before you go, just tell people where they can find you if they want to connect with you personally, get into your thoughts a little bit more, and then also where they can learn more about Time by Ping. And feel free to plug anything else you're working on that you want people to check out as well.
yeah, absolutely. I'm on the internets, mostly at Niket everywhere. I try to read all of those things, and you can shoot me an email at niket@timebyping.com if you want to get in touch and learn about the company.
Okay, awesome. Well, thanks so much again, Niket. Thank you, listeners, for tuning in, and we'll be back again soon with another episode of Startup Happy Hour.
Thanks for having me.